Chapter 1. The night was dark and stormy, the kind of night that made you want to curl up in bed with a good book and forget about the outside world. But for Alice, there was no escaping the horrors that lurked in the shadows. As she walked home from her shift at the diner, the wind howled through the empty streets and rain pounded against the pavement. Alice pulled her jacket tighter around her and quickened her pace, her heart racing with fear. Just as she was about to turn the corner onto her street, she heard a noise behind her. She turned around, but all she saw was a blur of movement and a flash of silver. Alice tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She felt a sharp pain in her side and then everything went black. When she came to, she was lying in a dark alley, her head throbbing and her body aching. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate and she collapsed back onto the ground. As she lay there, waiting for someone to find her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And then, just as she was about to drift off into unconsciousness again, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. Alice knew she had to get out of there, but she was too weak to move. She closed her eyes and prayed for help, hoping that someone would come to her rescue before it was too late. Chapter 2. As Alice lay on the ground, she could feel the presence of something evil hovering over her. She opened her eyes and saw the glowing eyes drawing closer, their malevolent light growing brighter with every passing second. Just when she thought it was all over, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from down the alley. The eyes disappeared and Alice let out a sigh of relief as a figure emerged from the darkness. "Hey, are you okay?" a voice called out to her. Alice tried to speak, but her voice was barely above a whisper. She looked up and saw a young man standing over her, his face etched with concern. "Don't worry, I'll get help," he said, pulling out his phone. As he called for an ambulance, Alice closed her eyes and let out a sigh of relief. She knew that she had been lucky, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics rushed to her side and helped her onto a gurney. As they loaded her into the vehicle, Alice couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her in that dark alley. And more importantly, who or what had attacked her. She knew that she needed to find out, before it was too late. Chapter 3. As Alice lay in the hospital bed, her mind was racing with questions. Who had attacked her in that dark alley? And more importantly, why? She was startled out of her thoughts by the sound of the hospital room door opening. Detective Jameson walked in, a look of concern on his face. "Miss, how are you feeling?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I've been better," Alice replied, wincing as she tried to sit up. "I understand," the detective said, his voice filled with empathy. "I need to ask you a few questions about what happened." Alice took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the night before. She told the detective about the dark alley and the blur of movement, the flash of silver and the pain in her side. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Detective Jameson asked, taking notes in his notebook. Alice shook her head. "I'm sorry, I didn't get a good look at my attacker. It all happened so fast." "That's okay," the detective said, patting her hand reassuringly. "We'll find out who did this, I promise. In the meantime, try to rest and let the doctors take care of you." Alice nodded, grateful for the detective's words. But as he left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. She knew that she needed to find out who had attacked her, and why, before it was too late. Chapter 4. As the days passed, Alice's injuries began to heal and she was finally able to go home. But despite the detective's assurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still lurking in the shadows. One night, as she was settling into bed, she heard a knock at the door. She hesitated, wondering who could be knocking at such a late hour. Cautiously, she made her way to the door and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw Detective Jameson standing on the other side. She quickly opened the door and let him in. "Detective, what are you doing here?" she asked, a look of concern on her face. "I'm sorry to disturb you at such a late hour, but I have some news that I think you'll want to hear," he said, his voice grave. Alice's heart began to race. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've found your attacker," the detective said, his expression serious. "It was a man by the name of John Davis. He's a known criminal with a history of violence." Alice's mind reeled at the news. "How did you find him?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We were able to track down a witness who saw him leaving the scene of the crime," the detective explained. "We also found DNA evidence linking him to the attack." Alice let out a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Detective," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for bringing this man to justice." "It's my job," the detective said, a hint of a smile on his face. "But I have to warn you, this isn't over yet. John Davis is a dangerous man and he's not going to go down without a fight. You need to be careful and stay alert." Alice nodded, determined to do just that. She knew that the danger wasn't over, but at least now she had some answers. And with the detective by her side, she felt like she could face anything that came her way. Chapter 5. As the weeks passed, Alice began to feel a sense of normalcy returning to her life. The threat of John Davis seemed to fade into the background as she focused on her recovery and getting back to work. But one night, as she was closing up the diner, she heard a strange noise coming from the back alley. Her heart racing, she cautiously made her way to the door and peered outside. To her horror, she saw John Davis standing in the shadows, a sinister smile on his face. "You should have stayed out of this, Alice," he growled, his voice filled with hatred. "You and that meddling detective have made things very difficult for me." Alice's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape. She knew that she couldn't take on John Davis alone, but she also knew that she couldn't let him get away with what he had done. As she was trying to come up with a plan, she heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. She let out a sigh of relief as she saw the flashing lights of the police car pulling up to the alley. John Davis let out a curse and turned to run, but it was too late. The police were upon him, tackling him to the ground and cuffing him as he struggled and cursed. As Alice watched the scene unfold, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. John Davis was finally going to pay for what he had done, and she knew that she had played a part in bringing him to justice. But as she turned to go back inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end of her nightmare. She knew that there would always be more dangers lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. But at least now, she was ready to face them head-on. Chapter 6. As Alice tried to put the events of the past few months behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She had thought that with John Davis behind bars, her nightmare was finally over. But as the days went by, she began to notice strange things happening around her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination getting the best of her. But as the occurrences became more and more frequent, she knew that something was off. One night, as she was closing up the diner, she heard a strange noise coming from the back room. She cautiously made her way to the door and peered inside, but all she saw was darkness. She was just about to turn away when she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the shadows. She let out a scream and stumbled backwards, her heart racing with fear. As she turned to run, she was confronted by a figure standing in the doorway. It was John Davis, a maniacal grin on his face. "You thought you could get rid of me that easily," he sneered. "I have ways of getting what I want, and right now, I want you." Alice's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to escape. She knew that she couldn't take on John Davis alone, but she also knew that she couldn't let him get away with what he had done. As she was trying to come up with a plan, she heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. She let out a sigh of relief as she saw the flashing lights of the police car pulling up to the alley. But as the officers rushed in and apprehended John Davis, Alice couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from the end of her nightmare. She couldn't understand why he keep on showing up, trying to scare her. The cops have arrested him 2 times now, but still he keeps on showing up. Why? She needed answers. Chapter 7. As Alice sat in the witness stand, she couldn't believe that she was finally testifying against John Davis. It had been a long and difficult journey, but she was determined to see it through to the end. As the prosecutor began questioning her, Alice's mind went back to the night of the attack. She remembered the fear and desperation she had felt as she lay in that dark alley, waiting for help to arrive. "Miss, can you tell the court what happened on the night of the attack?" the prosecutor asked, his voice grave. Alice took a deep breath and began to recount the events of that fateful night. She told the court about the dark alley and the blur of movement, the flash of silver and the pain in her side. "And can you tell us who was responsible for this attack?" the prosecutor asked, his eyes fixed on Alice. "It was John Davis," Alice replied, her voice steady. "I recognized his voice and his eyes when he confronted me in the diner." There was a murmur of surprise in the courtroom as the jury and the audience absorbed this revelation. John Davis sat at the defense table, his face contorted with anger and hatred. "Miss, do you have any doubt in your mind that John Davis was the one who attacked you?" the prosecutor asked, his voice stern. "No, I don't," Alice replied, her voice unwavering. "I am positive that it was him." As the trial continued, Alice's testimony was the key piece of evidence that helped to convict John Davis of the attack. And as she left the courtroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that justice had been served. Chapter 8. Alice woke up to the sound of her doorbell ringing. She groggily made her way to the front door, still half asleep. As she opened the door, she was met with a sight that sent a shiver down her spine. Standing on her doorstep were multiple men, all with the same face and body. They were all identical, with short brown hair and piercing blue eyes. Alice's heart raced as she recognized the face as that of John Davis, her stalker who had been arrested just a week ago. Panic set in as Alice tried to run, but the men surrounded her, blocking her escape. She could feel their hot breath on her skin as they closed in, their faces twisted into grotesque snarls. "What do you want from me?" Alice cried out, her voice shaking with fear. "We want you, Alice," one of the men hissed, his voice low and menacing. "We've been watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, the time has come." Alice's legs shook beneath her as she tried to push past the men, but they were too strong. She was trapped, with no way out. As the men closed in, Alice closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle. But as their hands reached out to grab her, she knew that there was no escape. The horrors that awaited her in the darkness were too terrible to comprehend. Chapter 9. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the men to grab her. But to her surprise, she felt nothing. When she opened her eyes, the men were gone. She stumbled out of the house, her legs shaking beneath her. She couldn't believe what had just happened. It had all felt so real. As soon as she was a safe distance away, Alice pulled out her phone and dialed the police. She told them everything that had happened, her voice shaking with fear. The police arrived a few minutes later, and after questioning Alice and taking a report, they assured her that John Davis was still in prison and could not have been at her house. They promised to send a patrol car to keep an eye on her neighborhood for the rest of the night. Feeling shaken but relieved, Alice made her way back home. She locked all the doors and windows, then crawled into bed, where she finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep. But even as she slept, the memory of the men with John Davis's face lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that someone or something was out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 10. Alice woke up the next morning feeling exhausted and on edge. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, her dreams haunted by the men with John Davis's face. As she made her way to the kitchen for a cup of coffee, she was startled to see someone standing in the doorway. She let out a scream as she realized that it was John Davis, the man who had been stalking her. "How did you get out of prison?" Alice demanded, her voice shaking with fear. "I never was in prison, Alice," John said with a wicked grin. "I've been watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, the time has come." Alice's heart raced as she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the floor. She burst out the front door and into the woods, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to escape. But no matter where she went, John was always one step behind her. She could hear his footsteps, feel his hot breath on her neck. She knew that if she stopped, she would be caught. Finally, her strength gave out and she collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She closed her eyes, hoping that when she opened them, John would be gone. But when she opened her eyes, she saw him standing over her, a triumphant look on his face. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She could feel herself fading, her vision going black as she passed out. She didn't know what would happen when she woke up, but she knew that she couldn't give up. She had to keep fighting, no matter what. Chapter 11. When Alice woke up, her head was spinning and her body felt weak. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, but she knew that she had to get out of there. She stumbled to her feet and began to run, her legs shaking beneath her. She could hear John's footsteps behind her, his laughter echoing through the woods. She burst through the trees and into her backyard, her heart racing as she ran to the house. She knew that she had to find a weapon, something to defend herself with. As she burst through the back door, she grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. She turned to face John, the knife clutched in her hand. "Stay away from me," she said through gritted teeth. But John just laughed, his blue eyes twinkling with malice. "You can't hurt me, Alice," he said. "I'm not like the other men you've known. I'm a ghost, sent to make your life a living hell." Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she watched John approach. She knew that she had to do something, but she was frozen with fear. As John reached out to grab her, she let out a scream and swung the knife at him. It connected with his stomach, slicing through his skin. But to Alice's shock, no blood flowed from the wound. Instead, a black smoke seemed to seep out of the cut, swirling around John's body. He just laughed, his face twisted into a grotesque snarl. "You can't kill me, Alice," he said. "I'm already dead. And now, you're mine." Chapter 12. Alice couldn't take it anymore. She had to get away from John and find out what was going on. She packed a bag and fled her house, not looking back. She knew that she needed help, so she hired a private investigator to find out who John Davis really was and how he was able to appear in her life. The investigator dug deep, scouring records and interviewing people who knew John. And finally, they came up with a shocking revelation. John Davis's body was lying in a cemetery, where Alice's ex-boyfriend was sitting, performing some sort of ritual. The investigator showed Alice pictures of the scene, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her ex had always been a little off, but she never would have guessed that he was capable of something like this. She was horrified and heartbroken, realizing that the man she had once loved had played a role in the terror she had experienced. As she stood in the cemetery, tears streaming down her face, Alice knew that she had to put an end to this. She couldn't let John haunt her any longer. With a fierce determination, she marched up to her ex and demanded answers. And as she listened to his twisted story, she knew that she had to do whatever it took to stop him and banish John's ghost from her life for good. Chapter 13. As Alice listened to her ex's explanation, a wave of disgust and anger washed over her. He had been using John's ghost to punish her for something she had done a year ago, a moment of weakness that she had long since regretted. She couldn't believe that he would go to such lengths to get revenge. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but hatred and resentment. She knew that she had to stop him, and with the help of the private investigator, she formulated a plan. They returned to the cemetery at night, armed with the knowledge and tools they needed to banish John's ghost for good. The ex-boyfriend was caught off guard as they approached, and it was easy for them to overpower him. Alice watched as the investigator tied him up and began to perform the ritual that would banish John's ghost. As the flames burned higher, John's ghost appeared, screaming in agony. Alice could see the pain and regret in his eyes as he realized that he had been used as a pawn in her ex's twisted game. And as the ghost's cries faded away, Alice watched as her ex broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as he realized that he had failed. As they left the cemetery that night, Alice felt a sense of closure and freedom wash over her. She knew that John's ghost was gone for good, and that she was finally free from the terror that had plagued her for so long. If you liked this video, please give it a like and share. Subscribe the channel for more amazing stories.